To discuss the regulation of artificial intelligence is Karman Lucero. He's a fellow at Yale Law School, and I just saw what my potential replacement could look like in the future with those virtual hosts. Talk to us about China's efforts to regulate AI. What are the biggest priorities, and how do they differ than other countries and other companies?
Hello. So China has been very active. Many have described China as sort of a front runner when it comes to regulating artificial intelligence, particularly AIGC, AI generative content. And so I guess one key difference, I suppose, is the extent to which they've already acted and already have regulations that just went into effect today. A second way in which I think they're different than other countries is the extent to which the government can act without much checks on its power. So particularly in this AI space, the regulators, there's multiple different regulators, and sometimes it's a little bit unclear who exactly is doing what, but there's very little sort of pushback from courts, and a lot of times the decision making and particularly the enforcement of some of these regulations can be a bit unclear. When it comes to what they're trying to accomplish, I think there's a lot of commonalities with other jurisdictions, including the United States and the EU, which involve concerns about misinformation, disinformation, online fraud, internet addiction, and other issues just related to sort of growing culture around internet use and sort of living in sort of the digital world today. I think one goal that's probably different than other jurisdictions is the heavy emphasis on ideology and security in sort of the Chinese regulations. The regulations that just went into effect today place particular importance on quote unquote core interests or core socialist values, and that, again, it's unclear what exactly that will mean in practice, but given the fact that the Cyberspace Administration, one of the key enforcers of these regulations, doesn't have many checks on its power, it will certainly be influential. And what remains at this point is to see exactly how they will be enforced.
Well, and there are some common concerns, as you mentioned, amongst other countries when it comes to especially generative AI, and we see these deep fakes. But how do you get everyone on the same page? How do you regulate the regulations and get different countries to agree on a standard? Are they getting to that point? Are there discussions? And could we see some sort of common standard internationally?
That's a very good question and a very challenging one. So in some areas, I think the possibilities of having a common regulatory
Body.
vision are quite low, particularly when it comes to, say, misinformation and disinformation, because everyone seems to have a different definition of what exactly misinformation is. In other areas, such as fraud and combating deepfakes, there might be more opportunity. But one that so far it seems most jurisdictions, or one issue that most jurisdictions seem to be neglecting related to AIGC, is the amount of low-paid labor that goes into the generation of these models. And that could potentially be an area where countries maybe could find common ground, but so far they have not. I am optimistic that even if, say, China and the EU and the US and other countries end up with very divergent approaches towards the regulation, that they could still at least communicate with each other about their different approaches so as to avoid potential misunderstandings going forward.
Artificial intelligence, it seems like there's something new everywhere you turn, by the day, by the hour. Could regulations stand in the way of some beneficial advancements or for companies making money?
Definitely. I mean, the answer is definitely, and in some cases that's the point, right? I mean, I think some of these regulations are aimed specifically at curtailing certain kinds of behavior that companies might find profitable, but that governments, for various reasons, whether politics or the social good or whatever, would like to curtail, even if it does cut into profits. In the case of China, I think some of these regulations might pose particularly onerous challenges for companies because they're not only sort of arguably the most stringent regulations, but as I mentioned before, there's no real pushback. There's no third party like a court or something like that that can sort of challenge the government's power or influence the way that these regulations are put into effect.
All right, Karman Lucero, thank you so much for joining us from New York. We appreciate your insight.